Rafael, passamos ao vivo. Muito bem, então, bom dia a todas e todos, buongiorno a tutti. É com prazer que nós estamos aqui reunidos para a apresentação do livro, da tradução do livro do professor Luigi Lacchè, Não Julgueis, Antropologia da Justiça e Figuras da Opinião Pública entre os séculos XIX e XX, lançado como e-book ano passado pela editora Lafayette, de Belo Horizonte, e agora esse ano finalmente saindo na sua versão física. Para a apresentação do livro, teremos hoje, além do próprio autor, o professor Luigi Lacchè, que responderá as perguntas dos nossos convidados. Temos aqui também presentes as professoras Daniele Bobeto de Araújo, da Universidade Federal do Paraná, Vivian Costa, da Universidade de São Paulo, e Ricardo Zontag, da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. Informo que, infelizmente, o tradutor da obra, o Fernando Coelho, não pôde se fazer presente em virtude de estar acometido da Covid nesse momento. Me relatou ontem, pediu desculpas, mas está um pouco mal de saúde a ponto de, infelizmente, não poder estar aqui conosco. Já desejei as melhoras por todos, e tenho certeza que em breve também estará bem. Explicando um pouquinho a dinâmica, então, basicamente, eu faço uma fala inicial, e depois passo para cada um dos nossos convidados fazer as suas perguntas, os seus comentários à obra ao professor Luigi Lacchè. Se vocês me permitirem, a ordem que eu selecionei seria primeiro a professora Daniele, em seguida o professor Ricardo, e finalizando com a professora Vivian Costa. E depois disso, também faço aqui as conclusões. O professor Lacchè responderá as perguntas em inglês, que serão feitas em português. Inclusive, no futuro, nós pretendemos também legendar o vídeo que ficará registrado no YouTube, aqui do canal do Grupo de Pesquisa Ius Comuni de Florianópolis. Muito bem, então, apresentando a obra, e trazendo um pouquinho para quem ainda não teve a oportunidade de com ela ter contato. Inclusive, informo que nessa semana o livro físico se encontra em promoção no site da editora, com belo desconto e frete grátis, e também o e-book continua à venda, disponível para quem tem a preferência por esse meio de leitura. É um livro que é fruto de uma conferência, então, na verdade, é um formato de livro de bolso, e traz, basicamente, um debate que faz parte de um determinado percurso de pesquisa do professor Luigi Lacchè em anos anteriores, que é essa relação entre processo penal e opinião pública, especialmente ao longo do século XIX e no começo do século XX. Esse itinerário que o livro acaba tratando. Mas o livro faz isso, e é importante colocar, de modo bastante original. Para além do uso das fontes tradicionais da história do direito, onde basicamente nós lidamos com legislação, doutrina e jurisprudência, o professor Lacchè trabalhou aqui com vários outros elementos. Além da própria questão dos jornais, tendo em vista essa relação com a opinião pública, mas também elementos importantes da tradição cristã, e aqui, no caso, também da literatura. Então, aqui nós temos algumas referências importantes nesse sentido. O que faz bastante sentido para uma pesquisa desse porte, tendo em vista a ideia já trazida por Marius Bricoli, depois aprofundada por Luigi Lacchè, por Márcio Meccarelli e tantos outros, acerca de uma concepção do estudo integrado do penal, em que leva em consideração não apenas os elementos estritamente jurídicos e vinculados à tradição estatal da modernidade, mas os outros elementos da sociedade, da cultura, que podem trazer algum tipo de referimento importante para a construção desse tipo de abordagem. Esse tipo de abordagem que já tem também aqui no Brasil algum efeito na história social, então nós temos desde os estudos clássicos aos contemporâneos, que tem se preocupado também com esse alargamento das fontes, e também no direito a gente começa a ter esse tipo de preocupação, para citar alguns elementos, alguns trabalhos orientados pelo professor Ricardo Zontag, que trabalham com literatura na história do direito, as pesquisas da própria professora Daniele acerca dos processos judiciais, na realidade de pré-independência do Brasil, são algumas das mostras de como a área tem se desenvolvido nessa perspectiva. E isso nos faz pensar que esse tema, e esse foi o construção da obra, ainda tem muita reverberação aqui no Brasil. Na apresentação eu cito pelo menos uns 10 ou quase 15 possibilidades, temas de pesquisa, tá, que podem vir a ser desenvolvidos justamente pensando nesse alargamento de fontes e nessa perspectiva ampla, né, do penal que o professor Lacchè experimenta aqui nessa obra. Então, nesse sentido que nós entendemos importante que a obra estivesse disponível também em língua portuguesa, para um público mais amplo, especialmente para os estudantes, né, nos cursos de graduação e pós-graduação, para que eles tenham, né, um exemplo próprio de como poder pensar a história do penal nessa perspectiva mais ampliada, mais arejada e, portanto, né, mais integrada com os vários saberes que a cultura jurídica necessita estar presente. Tá? Então, dito isso, nessa breve apresentação, tá, eu vou passar imediatamente a palavra para a professora Daniele. A professora Daniele vai fazer a sua pergunta e, em seguida, o professor Luigi Lacchè vai fazer a sua resposta. Vocês fiquem tranquilos com o tempo, nós temos aqui um tempo bastante amplo, a gente pode fazer tudo com bastante calma, tá? Então podem ficar à vontade em trazer os comentários que entenderem importantes, e o professor Lacchè também fique livre para o tempo que achar necessário para responder. Allora, professore, siamo liberi, inizieremo con le domande, il tempo di risposta è libero anche, abbiamo qui quasi 2 ore per fare tutte queste 3 domande con molta tranquillità. Grazie tanto un'altra volta, professor Lacchè, e passo a palavra a Daniele para o seu comentário. Muito obrigado desde já pela presença e pela possibilidade de estar aqui dialogando conosco.
Bom, bom dia a todos e a todas, aos companheiros de mesa, companheira de mesa, né, eu gostaria de registrar que é muito prazeroso participar de uma mesa institucionalmente plural, né, o que nos fortalece como campo de estudo, e paritária em questões de gênero, algo, infelizmente, ainda tão raro no Brasil. Assim, eu aproveito para parabenizar o Diego pela cuidadosa organização do evento. Agradeço a editora pelo capricho da edição do livro, né, por disponibilizar na língua portuguesa essa brilhante tradução feita pelo Fernando, que infelizmente não está aqui, mas porque a gente sabe que é difícil traduzir a língua de Dante, né? E também agradeço, por último, mas razão principal de estarmos aqui, gostaria de agradecer ao professor Lacchè, que nos brinda com a sua presença, comentando esse livro inspirador. É uma honra poder dialogar com o professor. Peço, então, a licença para ler a minha pergunta para ficar mais claro. Tá? Professor, o professor instigante Não Julgueis usou como fonte histórica as normas e a doutrina jurídica, mas também recorreu a fontes externas ao direito, especialmente crônicas policiais, produzidas por autores clássicos, como Balzac, ou crônicas policiais, publicadas em jornais. Tudo isso para destacar os aspectos antropológicos da justiça criminal e para ilustrar a transformação da concepção do processo penal na modernidade jurídica. Desse modo, gostaria de ouvir do professor a respeito da possibilidade de construir esse tipo de história, recorrendo também ao processo criminal como fonte. Assim, quais seriam as vantagens, professor, de tal abordagem para nós da historiografia jurídica? E quais os cuidados metodológicos que o professor indicaria para nós, professores e pesquisadores aqui no Brasil? A palavra é sua, professor, muito honrado.
Muito obrigado. First of all, let me thank a lot all of you for your presence, and starting from Professor Diego Núñez for promoting the Portuguese, the Brazilian edition of my conference, my booklet, Do Not Judge, Não Julgueis, and also for the translation. And so I would like to mention myself, Fernando Coelho, and of course the publisher Lafayette. Thank you very much. And today is for me another opportunity to meet young and very talented Brazilian colleagues focus on legal history. I, of course, mentioned Diego Núñez, but I would like to thank very much Professor Ricardo Sontag, Daniel Bobeto de Araújo, and Vivian Costa. Thank you very much for spending your time with me and talking about this edition. For me, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you because we have the possibility, even online, at distance, to continue our common discourse about some of the main aspects of legal history scholarship today, so research, publishing activities, methodological perspective, and maybe also to start to planning new projects together. So thank you to Danielle for our first questions. Of course, Diego was remembering the nature of this booklet. It's a strange destiny of this conference given in Naples more than 10 years ago, and then transformed in a booklet in Naples, then translated in German, then in Spanish, and now in Portuguese. But this is not something of systematic. There is not a theory about justice and public opinion. I could say that this is a very short and not easy way to face some issues, some themes that I consider very important to understand the contemporary dimension of justice. This book is focused on a dominant chronological dimension, so between 19th and 20th century, or I could say sort the Sattelzeit is between the 70s, referring to the Italian experience of 19th century, and maybe arriving a sort of ending point with the beginning of fascist experience in Italy. So I believe seriously that during this period we can study some of the roots of the origin of problems that we have today yet. So this is only to introduce our public. Regarding the questions, so what does mean opening law studies in general, and in our case legal history, towards other methodological, epistemological horizons. Is it useful? Do we need to go beyond our fence, our, I could say, rooted traditionally and also contemporary borders that all of us we have when we are making legal history? My question, of course, is positive. It's important. We need to open, to go beyond, but of course, this is not easy and sometimes can be also dangerous. So we have to be aware of the benefits, but also of the eventually some costs. I think that this is normal in our life. And I would like to start from a point. We, like legal historians, we are in, for some aspects, in a difficult position. Why? I think that you know very well, of course. Positive jurists, when they have contacts with us, tend to think that we are first and foremost historians. When we have contacts with historians, the so-called social historians, general historians, they tend to believe that we are first and foremost positive jurists, or in general jurists. So this is a position that in some ways can be a bit critical, because we tend always to affirm our legitimation discourse. Legal history is important for our students to educate them to the historical time and space dimensions and so on. And also, if we look at the historical, social historical dimension. So this is a sort of hybrid epistemological status. So we are aware about this status, and so sometimes can be a bit a problem. But if we reflect in depth about this hybrid, we have our fit into two shoes, and so we have to find an equilibrium, a balance. Our discipline is a balance discipline, because we have to be very attentive, because we are jurists. So the focus of our study is law, legal phenomena, legal dimension in time and the space. But at the same time, we have a methodology historically oriented. So I think that we have to think that this status today, I mean, in the last decades and now and probably in the future, is a element giving us a force. We are naturally involved in this kind of dialogue. For some aspects, we are mediators between jurists and historians. And we are very well formed. We are professionals. We are not amateur. The risk is that the historians are amateur when they start dealing with law. And the same when the so-called positive jurists want to go in depth studying law in the historical and in an historical dimension. So I think that this is a very important task, giving us a sort of epistemological force. It's in Italy, for example, there are colleagues that they are convinced that legal historians have to be first and foremost jurists. This is the mainstream. But what does it mean to be first and foremost jurists when we have to be legal historians? So we have to reflect about this perspective, because this is also, and I think that we know very well in our faculties, in our university, it is also a strategical point. Depending on our choices, also the relationships, the academic relationships, and some strategies at the local level. So I think that Diego introducing me was referring to the Marius Briccoli scholarship, and Mario used to say that legal historians had to he was using an Italian word, dedisciplinarizzarsi. I don't know if in English it does exist. Dedisciplinarization. He meant that legal historians had to be very careful in this perspective, and this was a condition for being better understood by other historians and jurists. So this is my starting point too. And just a few reflections about the specific topic of your question. When we use other sources, other kind of sources, of course, normally we can refer to economical sources, sociological sources, and so on. In this specific case of my text, I use in particular, and I try to use the methodological approach that usually is defined law and literature, law and arts, law and cinema, and so on. This is the starting point. I think that this is quite important also from a historiographical point of view, because and this is an aspect that we have to consider always. All these movements, law and, are linked to postmodern legal movements. So they have an history. There are some canon authors, and this is in particular an American discourse at epistemological and historiographical level. Then it's become a global perspective, but the roots, the origins are important, and we have to remember that. In my opinion, there is an aspect that is very important. Law is a narrative. There is a dimension of law, and this is narrative. So we share with scholars studying literature, cinema, visual arts, and so on, this aspect. Law and literature in particular share hermeneutics. Both depend on language. No, we always focus our attention on this aspect. So in our normative world, the normative world is common to us and people studying literature, cinema, and so on. So this is maybe a starting point. And so if we are aware about this perspective, probably we can understand better the possibilities that we have to enrich our methodology. I think that finally this is the main aspect. This is a way to enrich our perspective, our point of views, of course, staying within our discipline, our field. But if we are able to share this vision about law with other disciplines, other kind of knowledges, we maybe obtain two very positive results. The enrichment for us, and also the second aspect, we are able to play this role. At the beginning, I was referring to legal historians as a sort of mediator, and a sort of in-between status. Another aspect, and this is important because we we can come back to another starting point, the possibility to go beyond the limits, the borders that as discipline we have. We need to, of course, every disciplines need to have some limits, because we need to build up generation after generation of legal historians to build up a focus, to build up a specific angle by which to look at the reality. But we know that we need also to go sometimes beyond. Of course, it depends on what you are studying. In my research experience, for example, criminal law and justice is a field giving the possibility, and I could add also needing this kind of opening mind towards other dimensions. So we share narrative as a starting point, and also I could say to go beyond sometimes the narrowness of legal positivism. We need a bit of imagination. Sometimes I think that we can really add something new in our discipline if we are able to dialogue and to find concepts, categories, words already used by other scholars in other disciplines. So I think that legal historians in particular have to be flaneurs, as Baudelaire used to say. So walking in the city of the different disciplines, and here and having different stimulus. I think that this is valid for every discipline, but we are talking about legal history, and I think that for us is a living aspect. And of course, I don't refer to the problems about legal education. Now, from some decades, in legal education, this kind of approaches are used low end in a lot of ways. So we have not the time probably to reflect in particular on this aspect, how to use this kind of approaches of methodology for our teaching activities, and in general for legal education. For example, for some American scholars, they refer to a category, the so-called poetic justice. So Robert Cover and other, Martha Nussbaum, they think that you are a better jurist if you are able to feel, to cultivate a sensibility for the relation, for all different kind of relationships between law and life. Law is finally, and the protagonists of law are people, are women, are men, in different contexts, time, space, and so on. Finally, to conclude, in my booklet, Now Julgueis, I, for example, quote André Gide, the title, the original title, Non Giudicate, do not judge, of course, is a reference to the Gospel of Luke and a lot of different passages. But for me, first of all, the reference is André Gide and his literary experience as juror. André Gide wanted to know what does it mean to judge. And of course, you can experiment this sensation if you are a professional judge, but of course, André Gide was a novelist, was an intellectual, and so the only possibility was to be a juror. And at the end of his experience, he built up a very interesting publishing project, and the title of this project was Ne jugez pas, do not judge, No Julgueis. So this is only an example. I refer to Balzac. And this is not only a way to have a sort of satisfaction reading the Balzac masterpieces of many other novelists. I think that, and here I follow Balzac, he used to say that the poets, the novelists, the artists, in general, during their life, normally they suffer, and probably they, in some cases, they have no success. And Balzac, at the beginning of his career, was a novelist, but he was writing for other people. And Balzac used to say that the real artist, of course, the real artist is a prophet. I think that this is very important when we refer to the experience of narrative and imagination. What does mean a prophet? For Balzac, the artist is a prophet when he can go beyond the visible. We are normal people, and we can only feel what we are seeing. the artist go beyond. So prophet in this perspective, and in some cases, it's very easy to see that. Picasso is a prophet. Shakespeare is a prophet. No? All the history of literature and all these different arts. And Balzac was not a jurist. He studied law. This is another aspect. Probably my next book, I don't know when, but could be a book on this aspect. Why a lot of artists had to become jurists. This is the case of Balzac. Balzac studied law in Paris. So he was going, according to his family. His father wanted for him a rich career as notaire. Of course, Balzac had other ideas, and so this book could be on this moment when the artist says, I don't want to be jurist. To study law is not enough for me. I'm an artist and I need to go beyond. And Balzac, for example, in my opinion, is the novelist who, in a very important phase of the French history, as all we know, France between the Revolution and, I could say, most part of 19th century is a very, very important laboratory. So it does mean that in France we can see and we can feel a series of changes, of transformations. And Balzac is very conservative from the political point of view, is for some aspects an anti-revolutionary, is against the French Revolution and its legacy, some effects, the end of the aristocracy. But at the same time is an extraordinary novelist able to innovate and to understand the new world born from the revolution. And for example, in some points of his work, he says that the criminal trial is an extraordinary machine littéraire. Is a machine, starting from the technical device. If we look at the criminal trial as a machine, the mixed model of criminal procedure, a phase dominated still by the secret, a sort of permanence of the inquisitorial legacy. And the second phase, the hearing, the public debate, is the modernity. Opening towards the public opinion, where the jurors are, where the judges are, where the journalists are, and so on. So it's a wonderful way to look at the conflict between Ancien Regime, what is living of the ancient regime, if we follow the category of Arno Meyer, of the long 19th century, and the new world, based on richness, property, and so on. So, and I conclude, risks, a lot of risks. In particular, I think the amateurishness. It is not enough to read Balzac, to take a passage, some lines taken by one of novel, per Goriot or Une ténébreuse affaire. You have to study Balzac in his context and see all the relationships, all the links between the Balzac work and his time. So you have to apply your methodological apparatus to study Balzac, because we are not, we cannot study Balzac like the scholars focus on literature do. We are legal historians, so we have to open Balzac towards the dimension that we consider important for us, for our study. And I see that many times this is not the approach. The approach is often a amateurishness approach. And of course, this is something involving us, but also when the scholars, they are specialized in literature or in cinema or in other fields, and they take an article of a law, a part of a codification, and so on, and they believe that this is law. So I come back to the complexity. We need to show the complexity, so the integration. We need to show that law is a very, very complex phenomenon. And narrative, imagination, and so on are very important.
Muito obrigado. Essa primeira rodada já foi de tirar o fôlego. Então, sem mais delongas, já passo a palavra para o professor Ricardo Zontag, para que ele possa também fazer as suas considerações, as suas perguntas, e que a gente possa continuar nesse bate-papo interessantíssimo aqui com o professor Luigi Lacchè. Ricardo, a palavra é tua.
Muito bem. Muito obrigado, professor Diego Nunes. Para começar, eu queria cumprimentar a professora Daniela, a professora Vivian, que eu tenho o prazer de encontrar aqui hoje. É uma honra para mim, e principalmente cumprimentar o professor Luigi Lacchè, que é sempre uma honra enorme para mim ter oportunidades de dialogar e de aprender tanto, como já deu para perceber pela resposta à primeira questão, foi super produtiva. E aproveitar a ocasião para felicitar a editora Lafayette, na pessoa do professor Jordano Bruno e o professor Nunes, pela iniciativa de publicar a tradução desse pequeno, grande livro, e cumprimentar também o tradutor, o Fernando, que a gente sabe é sempre um esforço tremendo fazer uma tradução. Então, eu o cumprimento vivamente por esse esforço e espero que ele se recupere o mais rápido possível. Bom, então, eu também queria dizer que, para mim, é fantástica essa possibilidade de estar aqui hoje para colocar questões ao autor, né, desse livro. Então, por isso também, obrigado, professor Diego, por ter me convidado. Eu estou muito feliz com isso. E, bom, vamos à minha pergunta. A minha pergunta diz respeito à figura do advogado, que aparece então, na página 24, 25 do livro, o júri e o problema da, vamos chamar assim, esterilização dos debates no pensamento da escola positiva, em nome da análise científica do delinquente. Mas antes de fazer essa pergunta, eu queria explicar rapidamente a razão da pergunta. No Brasil, das primeiras décadas do século XX, existe um personagem que me chamou muita atenção. É o Evaristo de Moraes, um dos mais importantes advogados da então capital da República, o Rio de Janeiro. Em processos no júri, se dizia era muito difícil vencer o Evaristo de Moraes. E ele participou em vários casos célebres da época, como aquele sobre a morte do famoso escritor Euclides da Cunha. Então, são dois os aspectos desse personagem que eu gostaria de sublinhar. Primeiro, nas suas memórias, percebe-se que uma estratégia muito utilizada por ele era, por assim dizer, antecipar o início do debate nos casos de competência do júri. Ou seja, ele escrevia artigos nos jornais para influenciar a opinião pública. Segundo, ele era um defensor da escola positiva, mas era também um grande defensor do júri. Nesse contexto, o Nelson Hungria, o mais importante tecnicista brasileiro, se lamentava que as ideias da escola positiva nutriam, paradoxalmente, a retórica vazia, que ele achava que eram vazias, né, dos debates do júri, em detrimento da aplicação austera da lei. E o Evaristo de Moraes seria um típico exemplo da retórica advocatícia do júri que o Nelson Hungria desprezava. Então, eis a minha pergunta. Como que se estruturava a relação entre a figura do advogado, o debate, em particular no júri, e a opinião pública entre os séculos XIX e XX? Como que a escola positiva via o debate, em particular no que diz respeito ao júri? Em síntese, eu gostaria de compreender a colocação em um contexto mais amplo das duas dimensões que eu mencionei antes, o uso estratégico processual das intervenções nos jornais né, e a opinião favorável ao júri, mesmo sendo um positivista, né, desse personagem brasileiro do início do século XX. Muito obrigado. Grazie mille, professor.
Thank you, Ricardo. So, two very difficult questions, because when we refer to the interconnections between the role, the function, the activities of the lawyers, the advocates, and the relationship with the jury in the courtrooms, and more in general, the relationships with the public opinion, we refer probably to the central point of our focus. And I think that during the first decades of the 19th century in continental Europe, in particular in some countries, we can look at a turning point. A turning point, of course, deriving from some changes. Finally, during the ancient regime experience, so the jus commune legal traditions, of course, we have the advocates, but if we refer to the criminal law and justice field, we know that they cannot play a dynamic, active, relevant role within the trial. And for some aspects, the people accused cannot refer to the technical defense. And there is an American historian, Christine Maza, and she has studied the French experience, in particular during the 18th century, so the French Enlightenment context, and she studies the memoirs written by, in particular, lawyers, and in some cases, judges. But the most important reference is given by lawyers. She shows that during the 18th century in France, because of the fact that the lawyers cannot really defend their clients within the trial, they can write their memoir. They have different names, but finally we deal with some written text to defend the accused, and the lawyers write these texts, and they give this text to the judge, to the inquisitorial judge. The judge can read, or in many cases, he doesn't read the text. But the American historian shows that the real end of this memoir is not within the trial, but outside. So they look at the French society in change and showing that these memoirs are oriented towards the growing public opinion in France. Of course, we know very well what Voltaire was making, starting from the 1730s onwards. Justice, criminal justice, as you know, is the central point of the anthropological reformism within the Enlightenment framework. Is justice, is criminal justice. And when Voltaire writes something about the Jean Lacchè's affair became a huge editorial success, and the king is compelled to intervene. Jean Calas is dead, but the king can say that the judges in Toulouse committed injustice. So, according to this American historian, the cause célèbre, literature, so once again, we face with literature, because today we cannot really understand this aspect, because today the advocates, when they write something, their work is oriented towards the trial. In France, but also in Germany, in Italy, and so on, during the 18th century, we have this literature so interesting. The turning point is when the criminal lawyers, thanks to the transformation of criminal procedure, and once again, the infrastructure, the technical device, the so-called mixed systems, based, according to most part of scholars, the French Napoleonic Code d'instruction criminelle, 1808, and then many other declination of this model. In Italy is the modello misto. Modello misto, mixed model, because the instruction is dominated still by some inquisitorial marks, the secret a very limited presence of the technical defense, so of the lawyers. And the second phase is the opposite. When Balzac told about this machine littéraire, he highlighted this aspect, this conflict. Balzac, in one of his novels, told that sometimes in a debate, a criminal debate, in the beginning, things are not important. But these things, thanks to the trial, thanks to the debate, can become more and more important. He used a French word, immense, huge. In this context, the lawyers start to speak. This is very, very important to understand this passage during some decades, of course. From the silence to the word. So the discourses, their speeches, they are in Italian arringhe, no? Become the center point of this overview of legal procedure within the criminal trial. So the question is, these lawyers were speaking, and their discourse was oriented towards, of course, the judges, but also the jurors, also to the public assisting in presence the trial. So thanks to the so-called immediate publicity, there is a public. There are people in presence, they feel, they sometimes push with their voices, with their presence. And finally, outside the courtroom, there is the huge context of the so-called public opinion. And the only way to create and then to maintain a link with the public opinion is the press, is the journalism. In France, the criminal reporting started at the Balzac time, 20s, 30s. Stendhal used to read all the issues of the Gazette, the Tribunal. Probably some of the plots of his novel are linked to some famous trials during this period. So we have also a new kind of journalism, because there is a sort of circuit. You know, maybe on some of the most important Italian criminalists, Francesco Carrara, Enrico Pessina, Pasquale Stanislao Mancini, Enrico Ferri. They were scholars. They were very famous advocates, but they were also journalists. Journalists in this sense, in some cases, writing on newspapers like journalists. This is, for example, the case of Pasquale Stanislao Mancini. He has written a lot of articles. So there is this circuit, and of course, the advocates have to balance their strategy depending on their public. Because when you are speaking, you have to understand your public. Jurors are different from judges, from professional judges. So if you are using a tone for the jurors, maybe this is not the right mood for judges or for the public. So the courtrooms in continental Europe are full of protagonists, linked above all by discourses. So once again, we find this link between law and narrative. Law and imagination is a sort of a play of mirrors between all these actors, these protagonists. So a lot of discourses about the abuses. For example, Francesco Carrara understood very well which kind of risks there were following this way. So the liberal jurists, the liberal criminalists, lived on their own experience this contradiction. Publicity and orality and the adversary dimension are the modernity. And not by chance, they are constitutional political values. In all the liberal constitutions, you will find an article, 2 articles about the principle of publicity, of the hearings, of the debate, and there is a parallel between the public hearing of the parliaments and the public hearing of courtrooms. So this is the positive dimension, but of course there are a lot of issues. In particular, the mechanism is the jury. Because the jury is the most representative organ of the public opinion. In Italy, for example, this is very, very clear. When the jury is introduced in Italy in 1848, it's very strong, the connection between the introduction of jurors and the press crimes. At the beginning, they had to judge the crimes having as focus press, so political crimes. Then there is the evolution, and the jury acquire more and more competencies. And then the birth of the Court of Assizes, and within the Court of Assizes, the jury. So the liberals are aware about the importance, the constitutional relevance of the presence, of course, of advocates and jurors. But they understand very, very well also the problems on the other side of the same coin. And there are some attempts, the Italian case, to reform. For example, in 1874, they approved a sort of organic law on jury in Italy, so changing also some aspects of the criminal procedure in the Court of Assizes. And they try to abolish, to limit, and probably to abolish the possibility to make possible the mediate publicity. So the journalists cannot publish, for example, the names of the jurors, who the jurors are, their background, their professions, and also the activities, so discourses and reports made during the debate. And this prohibition lasts only 3 years, because then it's clear that it is impossible in a liberal regime, in a constitutional liberal regime, this kind of prohibition. So they finally have to recognize that in a constitutional regime there is this conflict, and this conflict is permanent. And this is the novelty within this framework: authority, liberty, the traditional conflict between authority or order and liberty. At the center is the pillar of the liberal regimes. There is a new protagonist, the media. And of course, in that moment, the media are the journalists, the press. So when you say, I'm in favor of jury, It's very complex. Or I'm against the juror. What does it mean? You are against the publicity? 2. You are against the orality? 2. Against the adversary dimension? And so on. So, Ricardo was asking about the Brazilian, some Brazilian experiences. In Italy, the strong, I could say, the constitutive presence of the scuola positiva. Of course, Italy, starting from 70s, is the country in which the criminal positivism, the criminal anthropology were born for many aspects. So, of course, there was a very strong presence. And of course, there are different positions, but I could say that in general, the most important scholars, Lombroso, Enrico Ferri, Raffaele Garofalo, and others, they were against the criminal jury for different reasons. There is a basic reason linked to the positivistic background. For the positivists, when the individuals are together as a group, of course, the maximum of critical dimension is the crowd. When the public becomes crowd in a negative sense. The theorist, the most important Italian theorist of the, I could say, the positivistic vision is Scipio Sigele, and Scipio Sigele used to say that the association of people is a problem. So the jury, when you put together 12 people having very different backgrounds, Garofalo used to say, but this juror, who are they? They are grocers, they are barbiers, they are farmers. How can they really judge and comprehend so complex things? So there is a huge debate. And of course, on the other side, we could say, the constitutional force of the jury and all the technical device, orality, publicity, adversary, and so on, had the force to resist to this very strong pressure against the jury. As you know, only the fascism, and not immediately. When Alfredo Rocco arrived, we could say, at the end of his huge reform of criminal law and justice in Italy, transforming the jury in a sort of German model of assessors. They continue to call, to say we have the jury, but this is not the jury. Because when you judge together with the judge, with the professional judge, this is not jury. The jury does exist only when they are sovereign. Of course, they can feel a lot of different pressures. Professional judges during the hearing, during the debate, because it's the president of the Court of Assize, is the dominus of this context. But the jury is sovereign. And this is the political constitutional dimension. This is a piece of popular sovereignty. A popular sovereignty, I mean, of course, in the context of a liberal elitist regime. We are not in a democracy. We are talking about liberal regimes going towards some democratization processes. So, to study the jury, to study how the jurors work, and all the context, lawyers, judges, journalists, and so on, is very important, because this is the central point of justice between 19th and 20th century. So I can legitimate my chronology, at least for the Italian experience, of course. This depending on a lot of different profiles. In Brazil is a bit different, in France is a bit different, and so on. But I think that there are many elements in common. So this kind of comparative legal history, in my opinion, is important also for this reason. Because we have the possibility to experiment this model in different contexts. So I call this model the justice of moderns, to say that there is a discontinuity, the elements of discontinuity prevailing on the element of continuity. There are a lot, of course, of elements of continuity. But if we want to comprehend, to really understand these turning points, we have to emphasize, in my opinion, the changing perspectives in time and space. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor Lacchè, mais uma vez. Ótimo debate também surgido a partir daqui. De fato, são questões que têm, como o próprio Ricardo colocou, motivado a construção de novos estudos nesse campo aqui no Brasil. Passo, então, finalmente a palavra para Vivian Costa, para que ela possa fazer a sua pergunta, e depois a gente possa escutar o professor Lacchè nessa última rodada de debates. Vivian, a palavra é tua, mais uma vez, muito obrigado.
Eu que agradeço, Diego. Bom, eu vou também fazer um mix de leitura e tentar falar sem ler aqui, mas eu acho que para quem ainda não teve a bela oportunidade de ler essa conferência, já pôde perceber, né, pelas respostas, que o texto é uma verdadeira aula de metodologia de pesquisa, né, sobre essa pluralidade articulada do penal, de que o professor Sbricoli falou, sobre esse campo multifacetado que é a justiça criminal, e que me interessa bastante, e acho que a todos que estão aqui, né. Então, antes de mais nada, eu queria parabenizar também a editora Lafayette, o professor Diego Nunes e o tradutor, o Fernando Coelho, pela publicação desse livro. Eu acho que ele vem em uma ótima hora, em que a gente já está nesse processo não mais de surgimento, mas acho que já de frutificação, né, da história do direito nacional, com todas as dificuldades que, enfim, o campo enfrenta por questões até já abordadas hoje pelo professor Lacchè. Agradeço imensamente ao professor também por, enfim, estar aqui e responder uma questão. Eu já me sinto, em certa medida, contemplada pelas respostas que ele deu, por incrível que pareça. Então, eu sei que o tempo já está um pouco apertado também, eu não sei se ele compreende bem o português, mas se for o caso de abreviar a resposta, não tem problema algum, porque eu já me senti bastante contemplada e instigada aqui pelas discussões que aconteceram até o momento. Bom, como eu falei, eu acho que o livro realmente dialoga com as pesquisas mais recentes da história do direito no Brasil, e eu acho que várias dessas pesquisas têm apontado na direção de que, enfim, tem buscado localizar o direito de muitas maneiras, né, apontando que os significados do direito numa ordem liberal, eles têm uma construção multissituada, então com uma multiplicidade de atores e sem necessariamente um único centro de gravidade. Acho que a obra dialoga bastante com esse ponto de vista. E, enfim, essas novidades impostas à jurisdição na ordem liberal, elas se devem realmente, em grande medida, né, e justamente, à esfera pública e as questões, as novidades e as rupturas que ela trouxe e ainda traz ao direito, né, ao pensamento sobre o direito, à interpretação do direito e ao fato de que as decisões dos juízes são cada vez menos solitárias. Então, eu queria tentar aqui um exercício otimista em alguma medida, mas acho que imaginativo, então também fiquei feliz que em vários momentos essa questão apareceu, né, das possibilidades imaginativas de se pensar a justiça criminal, estudar, e é uma perspectiva otimista diante de um horizonte bastante sombrio, que é o que a gente vive hoje no Brasil, e acho que em outros lugares do mundo também, né. E eu queria que você comentasse, se fosse possível, né, como é que agora, no século XXI, nesse momento em que realmente nada escapa ao olhar do público, né, em que os olhos estão em toda parte, e em que várias vendas começam a cair, algumas delas a gente até gostaria que não caíssem, né, que não tivessem caído, mas enfim, há vendas boas também caindo, então eu acho que eu falo aqui especialmente da visibilidade que questões, grupos, histórias, modos de vida, que por tanto tempo foram negligenciados, né, a visibilidade que eles ganham agora com enfim, com esse olho público que está em todos os lugares. Então, quanto a justiça poderia se beneficiar ou não de um novo ponto de vista diante desse contexto, né, de um olhar que se direcione realmente, né, a face, a cara dos seus interlocutores, de seus tantos atores e suas tantas possibilidades. Aqui eu estou recuperando uma ideia que aparece ao final da conferência do professor Lacchè. Então, se a justiça pode e deve ser encarada como arte de viver, me parece inevitável que novos arranjos de vida gerem novos significados jurídicos. E ainda que um tanto, né, significativo de novos significados jurídicos seja criado, ou menos intentado, né, a todo momento, talvez exista uma lógica aberta pela contemporaneidade, né, então pela essa disruptiva inserção da esfera pública, uma lógica aberta por esse novo momento, né, que não rompeu efetivamente com o passado. Falo aqui, dentre outras coisas, sobre o processo misto, né, sobre essas disfuncionalidades geradas pelo desequilíbrio entre a fase de instrução do processo, a fase pública do contraditório, que o professor Lacchè aborda bastante nessa conferência, né? Então, enfim, finalizando, né, fechando a questão, em que direção que poderia caminhar a nossa criatividade, de modo a pensar novos arranjos de vida e, consequentemente, de justiça nos anos que virão. é um exercício, enfim, imaginativo e é isso. Agradeço bastante.
Thank you very much for your questions and remarks, and they maybe allow me to conclude this debate, this discussion, going back to my first considerations. And the question could be the following one. Why the history of justice as a specialized field of the discipline legal history can really contribute a lot to the study of justice, contemporary justice. I think that, I don't know if in Brazil is the same, but for example, in Italy, this is very strong in Italy. There is a movement at academic level. This is a very fragmented overview, but maybe significant. I refer to this orientation in many, in several Italian law faculties. You find normally a course of legal history. That is a sort of introduction to the institutional aspects of legal history. And then you find a second matter, and the title is History of the Justice. History of Justice. And my conference, given in Naples in 1909, was delivered within a course of History of Justice. The students like a lot, at least in Italy, this kind of approach. And I think they like because they can balance, they can understand better how law is justice. Law without justice, of course, if we consider justice as a sort of metaphysical dimension, and then living justice. Mario Sbriccoli used the formula giustizia praticata, justice in action, not justice in the books. So we believe that this methodological perspective can be very useful for legal history in its work. It can be very useful for strengthening our possibilities to dialogue with jurists, in particular jurists involved in criminal law and justice studies, but also some sociological dimensions of law and so on, and also for legal education. So we have at least three dimensions. And so, of course, it does mean that when we make history of justice, once again, we have to balance between history of justice seen basically as history of the apparatuses, so institutions, judges, jurors, advocates, and so on. So they need to study these dimensions, sometimes separated. So it does mean that we study norms, techniques, procedures, offices, and so on. But, and I think that here we find once again many aspects I have dealt with history of justice like history of discourses. This second dimension, for example, Pietro Costa has highlighted very well these two sides. And when we say history of justice like history of discourses, we refer to action-oriented texts, text in action. So justice not in the books, but justice in its reality, in its complexity. So this is very important because, of course, we are most part of legal historians tend to, they try to make possible that our students can understand that law, legality, law has universality, uniformity, and so on, is only a side. And for many aspects, all these dimensions have to face a lot of issues. And through the history of justice, our students maybe can understand better that legal phenomena are more and more complex, diversified, depending on, we could say, our postmodern societies. So depending sometimes on gender, on sex, on ethnicity, and multiculturalism, and a lot of aspects that need to be highlighted because they show the complexity of law as art of living. So it does mean really to show that law in action, law in justice is a way, maybe a very relevant methodological approach to study today, not in the past, in our contemporary perspective. And this is because our societies become more and more heterogeneous, multicultural, and multiconfessional societies. So, legal historians, once again, through this lens is history of justice, can really contribute to the contemporary debate on justice. And I could add not only on justice, but also on the methodological debate about law today. And this is it, this developing this point of view is important because we feel that justice is changing a lot. When I say justice of moderns, so the framework between 18th, 19th century, of course, we feel that there are some of those pillars, they are now active, still present. But at the same time, we are living a revolution. Justice is, the destiny of justice is a revolution. And we can, now we can look at this revolution. One of this revolution is the more and more wide field of the negotiated justice. Once again, Mario Sbriccoli is a reference point about this category. So the alternative justice, reparative justice, restorative justice, and so on. They are all different dimensions of a same problem. Our societies cannot be ruled only through the sword. There is a colleague, she is a scholar on criminal procedure in Italy, Grazia Mannozzi, and she published a book, Giustizia senza spada, justice without sword. For some aspect, it does mean that justice without law, if we consider law as the main tool that the political sovereign can use as a sort of a sword. So, to study this kind of perspective, of dimension, historically, is very important because we can develop tools, point of views about this general perspective. And finally, justice and new technologies. The predictive justice is a reality in many legal systems. So data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. All these new technical aspects are changing or are starting maybe to change really in depth justice. Recently, I read a book, the Italian translation of a book of Antoine Garapon. Antoine Garapon, as you know, is a very important French scholar. He studied the judicial rituals and among many other kind of researches. And in the last years, he is dealing with this new perspective. And this book, the title in Italian is the despazializzazione della giustizia. The despatialization of justice. So he is reflecting on the fact that justice is more and more going towards a new dimension, the virtuality. So not the territory, not a material dimension, but a series of different virtualities. So how justice can change and how the society can understand and can like or not this kind of changes. Because once again, justice is really one of the pillars of a democracy. If we reflect, many passages of the national histories between 1920 and 21st are marked by some turning points, and these turning points are represented by some trials, some justice affairs. For example, I don't know, the French history could be made through this perspective. The affaire Calas, Voltaire, the king trial after the revolution and his family, and so on. The Dreyfus affair. I think that this is the same in Brazil, in Italy, and so on. So a sort of history of a society through the lens of justice. Because justice is at the same time is a mirror, but is a mirror reflecting lights and shadows. So deforming sometimes the images, the shadows of the actors, of the pluralism, the plurality of protagonists, of actors. So for this reason, and I conclude, I think that history of justice, a rich, integrated, well-rooted history of justice, able to create bridges with other disciplines, other methodological approaches, is a great resource for legal history and for legal historians. Of course, today we refer basically to criminal justice, but we could also make the same talking about civil justice, administrative justice, or other dimensions about justice. So for these reasons, I believe that dealing with justice and all this normative universe is very important to study the nomos of justice. I think that this is really an important aim for legal historians in Brazil, in Italy, everywhere. Thank you very much.
Grazie tanto, professor Lacchè. Muito obrigado a todos, né, com essas estimulantes palavras e praticamente um programa de pesquisa e de atuação colocados aqui nesse final. Nós temos a possibilidade de encerrar, né, mais uma vez agradecendo, né, a Vivian, a Daniele, ao Ricardo, especialmente ao professor Luigi Lacchè, pela possibilidade de discutirmos esse livro, né, como falar um pequeno grande livro, na medida que é muito estimulante. Lembro a todos que ainda não estão assistindo, que até o final do dia de hoje o livro se encontra em promoção no site da editora, então para quem tem interesse no livro físico, hoje é o dia interessante para adquiri-lo, e para quem quiser o e-book continua disponível lá também a preços módicos, né? Espero que seja, né, o primeiro de vários outros livros que possamos traduzir do professor Luigi Lacchè aqui no Brasil. Temos alguns artigos já também traduzidos, né? Para quem tiver interesse, na página, website do Ius Comune, né, nós temos ali as indicações dessas obras dos nossos principais parceiros de pesquisa, como o professor Luigi Lacchè, que já estão traduzidos para o português, como o professor Ricardo falou, né, é um esforço contínuo dos nossos grupos de pesquisa, lá em Belo Horizonte, aqui em Florianópolis, também sei que em Curitiba, em São Paulo, de tentar deixar disponível esses materiais ao público mais amplo possível. Então, creio que por hoje seria isso, né? Desejo a todos e todas um ótimo dia e, claro, uma ótima leitura do livro do professor Luigi Lacchè. Muito obrigado, até a próxima.
Grazie, a presto.
Grazie tanto.
Obrigada. A gente sai, Diego, ou fica um pouquinho mais?
Estamos livres.